Gallery owner locked black painter out of the show. His canvas was the only one that sold before doors opened. The doors were still closed when the buyer arrived. 6:40 in the morning. The Callaway Gallery on West Mercer Street in Seattle, Washington. A Thursday in early November, 2 hours before the public opening of the season's most anticipated group exhibition, 4 hours before the artist whose work had drawn her there would be permitted to enter the building that was showing it. The buyer's name was Margaret Chen. She was 53 years old, a private art collector of 21 years, and she had driven to West Mercer Street in the dark because she had seen a photograph of the painting 3 weeks earlier in a preview feature and had known, in the specific instant that certain collectors know certain things, that it was going to be gone before she reached it through ordinary channels. She had called the gallery at 9 the morning after the preview published. She had been told the work was not available for pre-sale. She had driven to West Mercer Street at 6:40 in the morning on opening day because she intended to be the first person through the door. Inside, the owner of the Callaway Gallery, a man named Spencer Callaway, was doing the final installation check. 41 works hung on the gallery's white walls. 14 artists. One artist's work was not represented by a physical canvas. His piece had been received digitally, printed by the gallery, mounted, labeled, and hung in the south corridor. The longest wall in the building, the wall that received the most foot traffic, the most light, the best sight line from the entrance. It had been placed there not as a concession, but as a curatorial decision, because when Spencer Callaway had laid out the show 3 months prior, this was the work that the room was built around. The artist who had made that work was standing on the sidewalk outside. He had arrived at 6:15. He had been told, in an email sent the previous evening at 11:47, the specific hour of a decision made too late to be answered before morning, that his presence at the installation and opening preparation would not be needed, that the gallery staff had handled his piece, that he was welcome to attend the public opening at 9 a.m. as a guest. As a guest. In a show, his work was anchoring. His name is Elijah Mensa. He is 37 years old. He grew up in Tacoma, Washington, and he has been painting since he was 11. He did not respond to the 11:47 email. He drove to West Mercer Street in the dark and stood on the sidewalk outside the Callaway Gallery with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the particular patience of a man who has learned, over 26 years of making things, that the work exists independent of every room that tries to decide what the work is worth. At 6:52, Margaret Chen arrived. She parked. She walked to the gallery door. She found it locked. She found, on the sidewalk, a man she did not recognize. She said, "Are you here for the opening?" He said, "I'm one of the artists." She looked at him. Then she looked at the locked door. Then she said, "Which piece is yours?" He said, "The one on the south wall." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I drove here at 6 in the morning for that painting." He said, "I know. It's a good painting." She said, "It's more than a good painting." He said, "I know that too." They stood on the sidewalk together for 4 minutes. Then Margaret Chen walked to the gallery's side entrance, where a light was visible through the glass, and knocked until someone answered, and told the gallery assistant who opened it that she was a collector, and that she intended to purchase the work on the south wall before the public opening, and that she would like to do that now. The gallery assistant took her inside. Elijah Mensa remained on the sidewalk. Margaret Chen bought the painting at 7:04 in the morning for $68,000. The artist who made it was still outside. Nobody inside that gallery understood yet what the morning had assembled. The only pre-sale in the gallery's 11-year history, the locked-out artist, and a buyer who would spend the next 3 years doing something with the purchase that Spencer Callaway had not anticipated and could not have predicted. They were all going to find out. The work always finds a way to tell people what it is. Subscribe and tell me where you are watching from. Now come back with me, not to West Mercer Street in November, back to where the painting was made, and to the 26 years that preceded the morning. A man stood on a sidewalk outside a building that was showing his work and was not ready to let him in. Elijah Mensa grew up in Tacoma, Washington, in a household where making things was not a special event. It was the condition. His father, a man named Kofi Mensah, who had come from Ghana to Washington State in 1981 with an engineering scholarship, and who had stayed because the engineering led to work and the work led to a life, was a maker in the broadest sense, a person for whom the response to a problem was to build a solution, to fabricate it, to understand it well enough to construct it from the material at hand. He built furniture. He repaired appliances. He had designed and installed the drainage system for the backyard himself, with hand-drawn plans on graph paper, because he had looked at the problem and understood it, and seen no reason to pay someone else for knowledge he could acquire. He was not an artist. He was an engineer who made things, and the making was so embedded in the fabric of the household that his children breathed it the way they breathed the air. Elijah's mother, a woman named Evelyn who had grown up in Tacoma and who taught middle school English and who had the specific, exacting relationship with language that people develop when they have spent decades helping young people understand that words are not interchangeable, that the right word and the almost right word are not the same word, and that the difference between them is the difference between saying the thing and almost saying it. Evelyn brought the other half. The attention to the particular. The understanding that precision was not pedantry but respect for the thing being described, whether the thing was a sentence or a feeling or the exact color of late afternoon light on Puget Sound in October. Elijah inherited both, the maker's hands and the analyst's eye, the impulse to build something that had not existed, and the need to get the particular right. He found that the medium these two things fit together inside was paint. He was 11 when he made his first painting that felt, to him, like a real one, not a practice, not an exercise, but an object that had captured something he had been trying to hold. He had been trying to paint the light in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, the specific way it came through the east window and fell across the table where his father read the paper and his mother drank coffee. And the house had the particular quality of quiet that belongs to mornings before the day has made its fathers. Demande. He had tried 4 times across 2 weeks, each attempt closer to the thing, each one failing in a different way, and on the 5th attempt, something had shifted, not in the technique, which was still rough, but in his understanding of what he was actually looking at. He had been trying to paint the light. He needed to paint what the light did to the things it touched. The shift was the shift, the one that every painter describes differently, and that means the same thing. The moment the eye learns to see differently than it has been seeing, and the hand follows, and the gap between the image in the mind and the image on the surface begins to close. He kept every painting, not because he thought they were good, most of them were not, but because Kofi had taught him that a record of work is the argument for the work, and Evelyn had taught him that the almost right version is not a failure but a clarification of where the right version lives. He numbered them and dated them, and kept them in a flat storage system he had built himself, from plywood and felt, following plans he had found in a woodworking book from the library. 237 paintings across 6 years of high school and the immediate years after. Not all of them finished. All of them kept. He did not attend an art school. He had been accepted to one, a program on the East Coast, with a strong reputation and an application process that his high school art teacher had urged him through with the specific urgency of a teacher who recognizes something that requires intervention, who had written a letter on his behalf that she later told him had taken her 4 drafts to get right, because she had wanted the committee to understand not just that he was talented, but that the nature of the talent was unusual, was structural rather than surface, was the kind that required the longest horizon to fully develop, and that formal training, if it was the right kind, would accelerate, and if it was the wrong kind, would interrupt. He did not go. He had been accepted, but the financial aid had not been sufficient, and the gap was not one his family could close, and he had looked at the gap and made a decision that he made without bitterness, and without the narrative of deprivation that a different person might have constructed around it. He looked at the gap, and he looked at the storage system of 237 paintings, and he decided that what he needed was more time and more surface, and he could get both by staying. He took a job at a fabrication shop. Metal and wood, custom components for architectural installations. He had walked in with Kofi's engineering vocabulary and his own maker's hands, and had been hired without a formal background because the foreman had given him a problem in the first interview and he had solved it before the interview was over. And the foreman was a practical man who valued the solution more than the credential. He worked the shop for 6 years. He painted in the mornings before the shift and on the weekends, and the fabrication work and the painting cross-pollinated in the way that practices cross-pollinate. When a person brings full attention to both, the shop taught him about material behavior, about how surfaces hold and release pigment under different conditions, about the structural properties of the substrates he painted on, about scale and load, and the relationship between what a thing looks like and what it is made to bear. He began to paint on materials the shop produced, not as a conceptual gesture, but as a practical experiment. He painted on aluminum sheet. He painted on composite panel. He painted on the kind of high-density architectural surfaces that were designed to be durable, weather-resistant, permanent, and that responded to paint in ways that stretched canvas and linen did not. He found, over 4 years of this experimentation, a method that was his own, not borrowed from any tradition he had studied. He had studied traditions, he read and looked constantly, but what he had arrived at did not fit neatly inside any of the categories that art school would have asked him to choose between. He painted from observation, but the observation was not representational in the conventional sense. He was painting the structure beneath the surface of things, the physics of light and material, the way Evelyn's precision had shaped his understanding of what was particular about a thing and what that particular thing was trying to say. A woman named Rosalind Burke saw his work for the first time at a local arts fair in Tacoma in the summer of his 28th year. She had stopped in front of a piece he had made on a 4-foot section of architectural panel, a painting of the Tacoma Narrows in the specific quality of light that belongs to the Pacific Northwest in early autumn, overcast but not dark, the water and sky differentiated by temperature rather than value, and she had stood in front of it for 11 minutes. He knew because he was watching her, and he had started timing at the 2-minute mark when he understood that what was happening was not a casual pause. At 11 minutes, she turned to him and said, "Who made this?" He said, "I did." She said, "How long?" He thought she meant the painting. He said, "About 3 weeks." She said, "No. How long have you been working?" He said, 26 years. She said, "It shows." She took a card from her bag. She said, "I run a small program for emerging artists. It's not well funded, but it's well connected. I think you should apply." Her card said, "Director, Pacific Northwest Arts Foundation." He applied. He was accepted. The program was, as she had described, not well funded but well connected, a 6-month residency with studio space, a modest stipend, and access to the network of curators and collectors and gallery directors that the foundation had built over 23 years of running programs for artists that the conventional discovery pipeline had not reached. It was through the foundation's network that his work reached Spencer Calloway. Spencer Calloway had been running the Calloway Gallery for 11 years. He was 49 years old. He had built a reputation for programming that mixed established Northwest artists with emerging voices, and the reputation was genuine. He had an eye for work that held up over time, and his curatorial decisions had been validated enough times that collectors trusted his selections. He ran a serious gallery. The programming was not merely commercial, but the gallery was also commercial. It had to be. And 11 years of making programming decisions at the intersection of artistic seriousness and commercial viability had produced in Spencer Calloway a specific set of working assumptions that he had not, in 11 years, been asked to examine closely. One of those assumptions was about the discovery pathway about which institutions and networks produced artists worth showing, and which ones existed outside the geography of his attention. The Pacific Northwest Arts Foundation was not outside his attention. He had been aware of it for years and had taken artists from its alumni network before. What was outside his attention was the understanding that the foundation's program existed specifically because artists like Elijah, not this artist by name, but artists of this kind, this background, This pathway had been systematically underrepresented in the conventional discovery infrastructure that Spencer relied on. He had not asked himself why so few artists from certain backgrounds came through his door. He had not asked because the programming felt good to him, felt diverse in the visual and stylistic sense, and he had confused visual and stylistic diversity with the structural diversity of access. He was not a bad person. He was a person who had not examined an assumption that the incentive structure of his work had not required him to examine. He had seen Elijah's work through the Foundation's annual showcase, which he attended as a matter of professional habit, and he had responded to it immediately and sincerely. The work was strong. It was unlike anything else in the emerging artist pool he was watching. He had approached Elijah after the showcase with the genuine enthusiasm of a person who has found what he was looking for. He had offered him a spot in the group show. He had handled the logistics of the show with the assumptions he always brought. The artists he knew socially, several of them, because his gallery had been showing them for years, were involved in the installation and the opening preparation in the organic way that familiarity produces. The artists he did not know, including Elijah, were managed at arm's length through the gallery's standard process: a shipping address, a digital proof of the piece, a contract, a checklist. The checklist was not designed to exclude, it was designed for efficiency. The result of the design was that the artist whose work anchored the show was standing on the sidewalk at 6:15 in the morning because an email sent at 11:47 the previous night had told him his presence was not needed. Spencer had not thought about what that communication meant from the outside. He had thought about the logistics of the installation, which were resolved. He had not thought about what it communicated to the person receiving it, that the work was wanted and the maker was not. At least not until the public hours, not until the social portion of the event that required the artist's body in the room for the performance of inclusivity that opening nights provide. He would think about it later. He would think about it specifically because of Margaret Chen. At 7:45 in the morning, Spencer Calloway walked to the front door of the gallery to check the exterior installation lighting. He found Elijah Mensah on the sidewalk. He stood at the door for a moment. He was aware of what was in front of him in the way that a person is aware of something they should have anticipated and did not. He opened the door. He said, "Elijah, I didn't know you were here." Elijah said, "I've been here since 6:15. Spencer said, "Why didn't you call?" Elijah looked at him for a moment, the look of a man deciding which of the true answers to give. He said, "I wanted to see how the piece was installed." Spencer said, "Come in, please." Elijah came in. He walked to the south corridor. He stood in front of his painting. He looked at it for 3 minutes without speaking. Then he made 3 small notes in the sketchbook he carried everywhere. Notes about the hanging height, about the lighting angle, about the way the sight line from the entrance interacted with the work. Not complaints, observations, data about how the room had received the work, how the work was performing in the space, what the space was doing that he hadn't been able to model from a photograph. Spencer watched him do this. He watched a man who had been excluded from the preparation of his own show use the first minutes of access to do professional work. He watched with the specific quality of attention of a person who is being shown something about themselves indirectly. He said, "I owe you an apology." Elijah kept writing in his sketchbook. He said, "For the email?" Spencer said, "For the email and for what the email communicated that I didn't intend to communicate, but that I should have understood I was communicating." Elijah stopped writing. He looked at Spencer. He said, "Do you know someone bought the painting this morning?" Spencer said, "Loretta told me, Margaret Chen." Elijah said, "She was on the sidewalk when I got here. She'd driven here at 6 in the morning." Spencer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was not on the sidewalk." Elijah said, "No." Spencer said, "I should have been." Elijah said nothing. He looked at the painting. He said, "Is the lighting angle adjustable?" Spencer said, "Yes." They spent 20 minutes adjusting the lighting together. Not because Spencer needed to demonstrate something, and not because Elijah needed to forgive anything, because the painting was on the wall, and the light was important, and the work was the work. The opening drew 314 people. 11 pieces sold in the first 2 hours. 7 more sold before the end of the day. The Callaway Gallery had not had a sellout day in its 11-year history. It had one in November. Elijah's piece, sold to Margaret Chen at 7:04 in the morning for $68,000, was documented at the show's entrance as private collection. Seattle, the standard notation for a pre-opening purchase. Dozens of people stood in the south corridor in front of the red dot beside the painting and asked the gallery assistants how this had happened. The gallery assistants said a collector had arrived before the opening. A number of people asked for the artist's contact information. The gallery provided the foundation's contact, as per the artist's instruction, because Elijah had learned from Rosalind Burke that the institution that had found him was the institution he wanted to strengthen, and that directing inquiries through it was a way of doing that. 7 of the people who asked for his contact that day followed up within a month. 3 of them commissioned new work. One of them was a Museum Acquisitions Committee member from Portland, who attended the show on the recommendation of Margaret Chen, who had told her the morning of the opening on the phone, at 7:15, standing in her car in the gallery parking lot, that the work on the south wall was the best thing she had seen in 3 years, and that the person who made it was standing on the sidewalk outside because the gallery had not thought to let him in. The Museum Acquisitions Committee member drove 3 hours to see the painting. She stood in front of it for 9 minutes. She found Elijah at the opening and introduced herself. She said, "I have a question I ask every artist I'm considering. The answer tells me more than the portfolio." She paused. "Why are you making this?" Elijah looked at her for a moment. He said, "Because I have been trying to paint the same thing since I was 11 years old. I haven't gotten it right yet. I keep getting closer." She said, "What is the thing?" He said, "The structure beneath what you can see, the physics of what makes a particular moment particular." She said, "You've been at it 26 years. He said, "Yes." She said, "What makes you think you'll get it?" He said, "I already have. Twice. I need to do it again and understand why it happened. Because when I understand why it happened, I'll be able to do it more." She looked at the painting. She said, "What number are you in the series?" He said, "I don't have a series. I have 237 attempts and 2 successes." She said, "Are the 2 successes in this show?" He said, "One of them." She said, "I'd like to see the other one." He drove her to his studio that evening, after the opening. She was in his studio for 2 hours. She looked at all 237. She stood in front of the first success for a long time, and then in front of the painting that had just sold, and then she sat down in the only chair his studio had, and she said, "I want to make a case to my committee for a solo exhibition." He said, "At the museum?" She said, "At the museum." He was quiet for a moment. 26 years of mornings in a fabrication shop and then in a studio, 237 attempts and 2 successes and a sidewalk at 6:15 in the morning outside a gallery that had his work on the south wall and had not thought to leave the door open. He said, "Tell me what the timeline looks like." Spencer Callaway did not wait for the Callaway Gallery's year-end review to examine what had happened. He started the week after the opening. Not alone, he hired a consultant, a woman named Dr. Amara Diallo, who had spent 12 years working on equity and access in the arts and whose approach was not diagnostic in the punitive sense, but structural in the useful sense. She looked at how a system produced its outcomes and identified where the system's design was generating results that the system's stated values did not endorse. She spent 3 months at the Callaway Gallery. She reviewed the application and selection processes, the artist communication protocols, the social and professional networks that generated the artist pool Spencer drew from, the gallery's 11-year exhibition history across demographic lines. She produced a report. The report was 51 pages long. It did not accuse Spencer of malice. It documented the gap between intention and outcome in the specific, evidence-based language of someone who has looked at 11 years of decisions and can show you where the decisions were not value neutral, even when they felt like they were. Spencer read it in 2 sittings. He shared it with his staff. He made 3 structural changes to the gallery's operations: a revised artist outreach protocol that expanded the geographic and institutional range of the gallery's scouting, a communication standard for all artists in a show, regardless of prior relationship, that established the same access and preparation rights for every exhibiting artist, and a paid curatorial residency for emerging artists who had not come through the conventional gallery pipeline, structured specifically to include people from programs like the Pacific Northwest Arts Foundation. He announced the changes publicly on the gallery's website and in a statement to the regional arts press. He did not frame the statement as an apology, Dr. Diallo had counseled him that what the arts community needed from him was not contrition, but action, and that the action would be its own statement if it was genuine and sustained. The first curatorial resident under the new program was a 23-year-old named Destiny, who had been a participant in the Foundation's Emerging Artist program for 18 months, and who had, in that 18 months, developed a framework for curating shows around the work of makers from fabrication and trade backgrounds, whose material knowledge produced approaches to visual art that the fine arts world rarely encountered. She had developed it because Elijah's story, which Rosalind Burke had told in a Foundation presentation as part of a workshop on artist career development, had made her think about what a curatorial eye trained on that intersection would look like. She pitched it to Spencer in her residency interview. He said yes, before she finished the pitch. The show she curated opened 11 months later. 16 artists. 8 of them had come out of trades, metalwork, carpentry, ceramics, fabrication, textile production. 8 had conventional fine arts training. The show was called Surface and Structure, and the thesis of it, as Destiny wrote in the catalog essay, was that the distinction between the two was less real than the art world had been treating it, and that the material knowledge of someone who had spent years understanding how surfaces behaved was as legitimate an epistemological foundation for visual art as any program curriculum. Elijah's work was in the show, not as the anchor this time, as one voice among 16, because Destiny understood that the point was not to make one person into the representative of a whole tradition, but to show the tradition at its breadth. His piece sold on the opening night. So did 9 others. It was the best-attended opening in the Callaway Gallery's 12-year history. Rosalind Burke attended. She stood in front of Elijah's piece for 7 minutes. She found him afterward and said, "You're getting closer," he said. "I know," she said. "The one in Margaret Chen's collection. Was that one of the 2? He said. "Yes." She said. "What's the number now?" He said. 261 attempts, 3 successes. She said. "What are you working on?" He said. "The 4th. She looked at him. She said. "How long?" He said. "As long as it takes." He said it the way Amos Beaumont had said it, the way Leonard Achebe had said it, the way all the people in these stories have said the version of the same thing, not as resignation, not as martyrdom, but as the precise statement of a person who has located the relationship between time and work and has understood that the relationship is not a transaction, but a condition. The work takes what it takes. You do not negotiate the terms. You show up and you work, and you keep the record, and you stay until the gap between the image in the mind and the image on the surface closes, and then you start again. The morning you have been waiting for arrives. Sometimes you have to stand on the sidewalk for a while first. The morning arrives anyway. The painting knows what it is. The room catches up eventually. The thing I cannot put down is the first painting he kept, not the first one he made. The first one he kept, the Sunday morning kitchen, the east window, the light on the table, the 5th attempt, the one where he understood that he had been trying to paint the light and needed to be painting what the light did to the things it touched. He was 11 years old. He was wrong about the painting in the technical sense. It was rough. It was not yet what he could see, and he was right about it in the essential sense. Something had shifted, and the shift was real. And it needed to be kept because the shift was the thing, not the painting. 237 attempts, 2 successes, then 3. The record kept because the record was the argument. The numbered paintings in the felt-lined plywood storage system, every one of them dated, because Kofi had taught him that a record of work is the argument for the work, and Evelyn had taught him that the almost right version is not a failure, but a clarification of where the right version lives. He stood on a sidewalk for 2 hours and 45 minutes. The painting sold for $68,000 while he was standing there. The room, eventually, adjusted. And here is what I want to ask you. the version that is real, not the version that sounds good. Is there a thing you have been making that the room has not yet received? Not a thing you want to make. A thing you have been making in the mornings, before the shift, on the weekends, in the studio that might be a kitchen table or a storage unit, or a corner of a room that belongs to several things at once. The thing that is not finished yet, but that you have been narrowing toward for longer than you have told most people. The fifth attempt and the sixth and the seventh, each one failing in a different place, each failure a clarification of where the right version lives. Are you keeping the record? Not to prove something to the room, because the record is the argument, and the argument is what you show someone when they finally stand in front of it for 11 minutes and ask who made this. One word in the comments. Not the room that locked you out, the thing. The painting, the book, the business, the code, the composition, the practice, the one thing you have been narrowing toward. One word. Share this with someone who is on the sidewalk right now. Someone whose work is already inside a room that has not yet thought to open the door. They need to know that the work is in there, visible, on the wall, lit from the right angle, and that the buyer sometimes arrives before the gallery does. Subscribe. Because I am not done finding the people who kept the record when the room was not watching, and every time I find one, the number is larger than they told themselves it was. And next time I want to tell you about a 73-year-old Ugandan-American documentary filmmaker who spent 28 years trying to distribute a film that the festival circuit kept passing on. And on the morning, a streaming platform picked it up without a submission because an acquisitions editor had seen a clip on a personal account and called the filmmaker directly. It was watched by 4 million people in 9 days. Same story, different frame, same patient, precise vision that never stopped shooting. I will see you there.